Hello and welcome to Sprott Radio. I'm your host, Ed Coyne, Senior Managing Partner at Sprott Asset Management. I'm pleased today to welcome Britt Gitt, energy entrepreneur, writer, and public speaker. Britt joins us today with over 20 years of experience in the energy industry. Britt, thank you for joining Sprott Radio.
Thanks for the invite. Looking forward to our conversation.
Yeah, same here. Well, Britt, before we explore really all the opportunities we're seeing in the energy market today, I thought it'd be interesting for our listeners to hear a bit about your background and some of the work you're doing over at your current company, Oklo, Inc.
Sure. So on a day-by-day basis, I lead business development for Oklo. And Oklo designs, builds, and operates advanced nuclear power plants. And so most of my day is filled with talking with data center developers and operators, talking with industrial sites, commercial, any type of large energy customer that is interested in purchasing power. So that's how I spend my time today. But over the last 20, 25 years, I've been working in the energy industry, not necessarily in nuclear power. That's a more recent. I've just joined Oklo a little shy of 2 years ago, but I've worked on all kinds of energy technologies. I've worked on wireless power. I worked on running utility programs in California, whether they be energy efficiency programs or various commercialization efforts of new technologies like alternative fuel vehicles or carbon sequestration of power plants, all kinds of stuff. And all of these experiences really led me to focus on nuclear power because it is really clear it is the path forward to have low cost, reliable, affordable energy.
In addition to kind of your day job, both at Oklo and prior to Oklo, you somehow found the time to write a book. And the book was titled In the Dark. If you don't mind, just sharing a bit about that whole process, what you learned from that, and what sort of drew you to taking that endeavor on.
Writing a book is hard. Distilling down all your ideas is a challenging process. And I think what compelled me to write the book is just to share a little bit of my own personal experience and background working in the energy industry. So as I mentioned, I've been working in the space for over a couple decades. And, I made a lot of errors in judgment and thinking in terms of which technologies I thought were really going to scale and reduce emissions and really minimize our environmental footprint. And I think that today, what I'm seeing is many of our leaders, whether they be politicians or corporate leaders, are making a lot of the same mistakes that I made on my journey. So I thought I'd just share some of the thoughts and lessons learned that have come through those experiences and just what is the path forward? How should we think about designing and evaluating energy programs and technologies to really get us to the end goal?
Coming to the nuclear side of things, I got to believe partly the process of writing that book sort of brought you to nuclear. Certainly not the answer, but a very big part of the overall answer as we move forward. Talk a bit more about that, of what you're seeing in current nuclear technology, but more importantly, what you and Oklo are all working on with newer technologies. What's happening in that space today?
Well, I think if we look backwards across time, and what we've seen is human progress and all of our evolution as a culture across many thousands of years is all predicated on how we harness and leverage energy. And it's always moving to higher and more concentrated forms of energy. So we started with renewables, right? That using the sun and the wind and wood. And then we worked from there to more dense energy, from wood to coal and then to gas and oil, et cetera. And ultimately moving towards nuclear power, because nuclear is the most concentrated form of energy we have that can give us the key attributes that we're looking for, like we talked about, that reliable, affordable, and clean. So I think that's the journey we've been on as a species over many thousands of years. Mm-hmm. And that is our destiny. That's where we're going. Not to say that there aren't multiple energy technologies that are going to play a role in our energy system, because obviously they are. But ultimately, I think that is important to realize is that that's where we're aiming at. And ultimately, whether everyone agrees about that, obviously there's a difference of opinion today. But I think that trajectory is pretty clear of where we're going to be evolving to.
And when you think about energy, are you guys focused predominantly on the production or creation? Or are you also looking at the consumption? How are companies using it? How are individuals using it? What's driving you all at your firm as it relates to thinking about new technologies going forward?
Well, we're in a really unique time right now. So when you look backwards about 2 decades, for example, in the United States, the electricity consumption and load has been flat, right? We haven't been really growing. And there wasn't a whole lot of incentive for utilities to invest in new technologies because we had really cheap natural gas. The load wasn't growing. For most of that time, we didn't really have a lot of intense climate policies or various emission reduction policies that were truly driving investment decisions from the utilities and kind of other actors. And so you just didn't see a lot of activity. It was kind of business as usual. Well, all of a sudden, the whole game has changed. Number one, power demand is soaring. And we're seeing this in all the major data center hubs throughout the US, as well as lots of new manufacturing demand. You know, we're looking at, depending on which study you look at, I mean, you look at Boston Consulting Group or McKinsey or any of these, they're all saying we're going to increase power consumption just from data centers alone by 2 to 3 times by 2030, right? And then when you look at corporations and how much clean power they say they're going to buy, between now and 2030, they say they're going to buy 105 gigawatts of clean power, right? So we have all of these big Fortune 500 companies saying they're going to buy all this new clean power. We're seeing data centers and manufacturing capacity growth just skyrocketing. And when we look at, well, what are the available solutions to this? How are we going to meet this surging demand? And most of the solutions are suboptimal. I mean, most of these require transmission, right? And transmission can take over 10 years to build out in many parts of the country. So it's a big bottleneck on connecting any kind of generation. It's just having that transmission infrastructure. Well, we're certainly not going to be building new coal plants. And maybe we will, obviously, in India and China, they're continuing to build coal. But in the United States and in parts of Western Europe, it's just not really politically feasible. And in fact, the US EPA just came out with a new power plant rule just a couple of weeks ago, 2 to 3 weeks ago, that is basically going to force the premature retirement of coal plants, and also it is restricting, putting a lot of new requirements on building new natural gas plants. Effectively, by 2032, these plants are going to have carbon capture and storage, which is going to add a huge amount of additional cost to building these plants. And it has a huge tax on their productivity, because you can cut the overall productivity of a plant by 25% because of all the energy you're using to run that carbon capture and storage system. Ultimately, we're not going to be building a lot of coal plants.
Right.
And the amount of natural gas plants is going to be somewhat restricted because of these requirements. Then when you look at intermittent renewables like wind and solar, we're certainly going to build more of it. But right now, there's massive interconnection queues just to connect it in, for example, in PJM, which is a grid that covers about 65 million people in the mid-Atlantic. You know, this is Maryland and Pennsylvania and Ohio, that region of the U.S. They're looking at 5-year interconnection queues. So they're queuing up for 5 years just to connect to the grid, right? And it's getting worse, not better. Large nuclear plants are fantastic, and we're huge fans of them. I think we should build lots of large nuclear plants. But the reality is, in the U.S. at least, after the recent experience in Georgia with the Vogtle plant, and that project was 7 years behind schedule, $17 billion over budget. And there's just a real risk aversion to putting that kind of upfront capital into these projects. And even though we learned a lot from it, the AP1000 design, even in China, it takes over 9 years to build those. And the Chinese have a very sophisticated workforce and supply chain, and they don't have the aircraft impact rule that the Nuclear Regulatory Commission has over them. I mean, they know how to build nuclear plants, right? And it still takes China over 9 years to build AP1000. So we're not going to build those quick. Those are not going to come online anytime. And I hope we do build more, but they're not coming online anytime soon. And so what are we really left with here? We're left with natural gas and small nuclear, right? Those are really the two different options. We're certainly going to build more natural gas, but as I just said, there's new EPA requirements that are going to increase the cost, restricting where you can build them, and just make it harder overall to incorporate carbon capture and storage by 2032. That's not so far from now.
No.
And in addition to that, most of the Fortune 500 companies, like all the big data center companies, whether it's Amazon, Google, Microsoft, all of those companies, they have very aggressive emission reduction targets. And although I personally think that natural gas is a clean burning fuel and a perfectly viable solution, those companies don't share that opinion. And therefore, they don't help them meet their various emission reduction goals. So that really puts natural gas at a huge disadvantage. Now, that doesn't mean we're not going to build more of it. It just means that that's not what they're preferring. So advanced nuclear and small nuclear power plants are really, really well positioned to tackle this, right? Because you don't need the same amount of transmission build out because you can co-locate next to the load. You can build right next to the data center on site or at the factory. So you're not waiting those 10 years for transmission build out. You're able to have zero emissions, whether it's air emissions or CO2 emissions. So it's perfect for all these Fortune 500 companies that are trying to hit those emission reduction goals. And I think as this scales, we'll be able to be cost competitive. And historically, let's just be honest, nuclear power has faced three really big challenges: high upfront costs, long build times, and public perception challenges around safety and waste. Now, perception is not always reality, but it is reality, right? Because you have to deal with people and where they are. So those historically were the three big challenges. So Oklo is innovating in several areas to tackle each one of those. So we can walk through those if that's useful.
Yeah, that'd be great.
So let's talk about the high upfront costs. So traditionally, if you're going to build, let's say 1,000 megawatt nuclear power reactor in the United States, you're talking about $5+ billion worth of investment capital. And traditionally, a technology vendor would have to partner up with the utility and then come up with all that capital, right? So if you're a data center, your factory, you're not going to be building that. I mean, you're not going to be able to access that unless you're contracting through the utility. So one of the big innovations that Oklo is unlocking is by scaling down the size. We build 15 megawatt electric and 50 megawatt electric modules. So these individual powerhouses, and you can scale them. So if you want to build 500 megawatt deployment, great. Just put 10, 50 megawatt blocks there, right? So it's just Legos, right? You just can mix and match and you can scale up and down. But now, instead of a minimum threshold investment of $5 billion, now you're on the order of, let's say, $100 million. Obviously, it's a huge difference in the risk profile, in the appetite for project finance. And now with long-term power purchase agreements, you can finance against the revenue of the asset, of the power plant. This is the same way that renewable energy projects have been financed. And this really reduces the risk profile of the project. And now, because you've scaled it down, now you can contract with data centers and manufacturing companies and various industrial sites. So business models can change industries. And this is why what Oklo is doing, the real innovation here is on the business model and the licensing strategy. The technology has been around a long time. It was developed in the 50s. There's over 400 reactor operational years of experience working with sodium fast reactors, which is the basic technology that we're building, right? And there's been over 20 of these built around the world. It's not a technology problem. It really was a business model problem and a licensing strategy problem. And so this is similar to what Amazon did with cloud computing. When Amazon first introduced cloud as a service, basically compute, where if you were a Fortune 500 company, instead of taking a bunch of your capital, going out and investing in all these servers, hiring a bunch of people to rack those servers, test them, operate them, decommission them, deal with that whole life cycle, all of a sudden you could just plug into Amazon Web Services and buy compute as a service. Well, Oklo is doing something similar with nuclear power. Whereas these companies would never in a million years design, build, and operate, or even forget design, just build and operate a nuclear power plant. If you're a data center or you're a factory, right? Well, now they can just plug in and buy energy as a service in a similar way that Amazon offered that. Amazon didn't, design brand new servers. It wasn't a technology breakthrough. The business model completely changed the entire industry. And that is what Oklo is doing with advanced nuclear.
Do you see a future where someone like an Amazon actually gets into the energy business, where they're effectively having modular reactors built for their centers and actually not even hitting any of their grid. It's theirs. Do you see a future where that's a likelihood? Or are we already seeing that? We just don't know about it yet.
There's two big trends that are converging. First is power availability. And that's kind of what I was alluding to earlier. I think through the eyes of history, when we look back, you're going to look at basically the summer of 2022 is the starting gun when really the whole game changed. And what happened was the utility that serves Northern Virginia, basically one county where a huge concentration of the data center capacity is, basically told the data center industry they were out of power because they didn't have enough transmission capacity to bring in more power to allow the data centers to grow. Well, this was unexpected and set off an absolute panic in the data center industry. And all of these large companies started spreading out and going on a land grab across the United States, across all the major data center hubs, whether it's Atlanta, Georgia, Dallas, Texas, Columbus, Ohio, Phoenix, Arizona, Chicago, Illinois, all of these hubs. And they started buying up any available capacity and land adjacent to infrastructure. And once that was all bought up, all of a sudden it became a real problem. Where are we going to get more power? And so power availability is the number one challenge. Then when you add on to the power availability challenge, and by the way, this isn't just about data centers, but because they are eaten up and soaked up all that power, now all the other industries don't have access to it either. Right?
That's exactly what I was going to point out.
If you want to build a new factory, you're competing for energy with those data centers. And if there's just not that available capacity there. So it's not just in that one vertical. It impacts everyone. So now you layer on top of that what's happening with all of these climate action and very aggressive emission reduction goals that all the Fortune 500 companies have. The U.S. military has. Just this morning, I was on a call with the U.S. Army, and they're putting out a new solicitation. They're wanting to see microreactors being a form of resilient and reliable power at military bases. They're the largest purchaser of power in the entire country. It's the U.S. military and Department of Defense, right? So,
and I want to stop you there for a second because I don't know that many people that can say casually, I was on the phone this morning with the U.S. Army.
Well, this was a public webinar. It wasn't, but
this is what we're talking about. I mean, how you guys are so far advanced and what you're working on.
Yeah, I mean, just to be clear, this wasn't a private conversation, but honestly, the thing I love most about my job is every day I am getting to have these kinds of interactions and conversations and tour the inside of these mission critical facilities and data centers, go to these chemical manufacturing plants where they're making this stuff, or talking with Department of Defense about what their resilience and reliability requirements are. I mean, it's fascinating, right? You get to learn so much about each of these unique industry verticals and what their needs and aspirations are. You have this convergence, those two trends, power availability, clean power, all smashing together at the same time. And as I alluded to before, all the existing solutions are relatively suboptimal in their own way. And everything has trade-offs. Advanced nuclear isn't perfect, right? There's always trade-offs in anything, but it just presents a very viable and preferred option for many of the core attributes of the technology.
This is the developed world, right? Where our biggest concerns are, hey, we want more computing power. We want more storage of our material through data centers and so forth. What about the rest of the world? They need more energy also. And so I got to believe, and you sort of alluded to this earlier, this supply demand squeeze is, I think, not being fully realized yet, as the world is all saying, hey, we need more power over here also for basic block and tackle things. Forget the advancement of AI and so forth.
Yeah, energy is so foundational to modern life, right? If you and I woke up tomorrow and didn't have access to reliable, affordable energy that we do today, I mean, think of every part of your day, from how you keep your food from going bad to how you get to work. You can't use the internet. You can't leverage all of these tools and information and communication systems. It really shines a light on the huge disparity, as you alluded to, between the developed world and the developing world. And quite frankly, developing world, understandably, wants to live like we do. And I don't blame them. And I think we should do everything we can to support their growth and prosperity. And when we talk about energy, it's really important to, like, what is energy, right? I mean, the common if you cracked open a physics book, right, it would say energy is the capacity to do work, which is obviously true. However, I think there's a clear definition that it really expands on that. Energy is freedom. Energy is freedom from darkness. It's freedom from cold. It's freedom from disease. It's freedom from drinking dirty water. It's all of the things that are critical survival aspects and enablers of modern life is facilitated by energy. So it is absolutely mind-boggling, for example, today, where you can have an entity like the World Bank restricting power plant development and pipeline infrastructure, let's say in Africa or other developing countries, in the name of reducing CO2 emissions, when those countries, those developed countries, get over 80% of their energy from fossil fuels. That, to me, is immoral. That's completely immoral. This is so foundational to everything that we care about. So energy is freedom. And we should be enabling freedom and prosperity around the world, not cutting it off. When you choke off energy, you're choking off freedom, you're choking off economic opportunity.
Well, let's go back to something that I read and also a brief video I watched as it relates specifically to your company, to Oklo. And, a term that I'm seeing talked about a little bit more out there is fast reactors versus fast breeder reactors. And I think it would be really cool for our audience to hear basically what they are and how they're different and where are you guys going or where are you leaning to or towards within your company. So if you just kind of crack that open a bit and walk us through the fast reactors versus fast breeder reactors and what they're all about.
Sure. Well, the definition of a fast reactor is basically the speed at which the fission process is happening. And a lot of our traditional, let's say, large light water reactors, they use a moderator to slow the neutrons down, basically, in that process. Whereas fast reactors, you don't use a moderator, so they're just moving at much higher speed. And ultimately, fast reactors usually can operate at higher levels of efficiency and use higher enriched fuel in the process. So you're basically getting more energy out of the same process. Now, the difference between a breeding reactor and not is breeding means you're in essence making new fuel, right? So in the process, you're saying 1 + 1 = 3 in a way, right? Now, we're not breeding fuel. So just to be clear, Oklo, we operate fast reactor, a sodium metal fast reactor, but we're not actually breeding to create new fuel. Now, we are incorporating fuel recycling into our strategy. And this is really important, especially for your audience here, given the interest in uranium and investment in the space. So what I find fascinating is in the United States today, after 70 years of commercial operation of large nuclear power plants, there's about 90,000 metric tons of spent fuel in the U.S. That fuel, over 90% of the energy is still in it because it only goes into these large light water reactors for about 18 months or so, 18 to 24-month refueling cycles for economic reasons. But that means that 90% of that energy is in it. You can recycle that spent fuel and turn it into new fuel to go into these fast reactors, which is really one of the key advantages of fast reactors versus maybe the traditional large light water reactors. You can leverage recycled fuel. And what this could do, just the amount of, now it sounds like a lot, 90,000 metric tons, but all of that, because uranium is so heavy, right? All of that by volume could fit in one Walmart supercenter. Think about it.
Wow.
70 years of commercial operating plants generating approximately 20% of all the electricity in the United States could fit in one Walmart supercenter. And that energy that's still in that used fuel, in that so-called waste, which is not really waste, could power the U.S. for over 150 years. So that is what we want to unlock. And we want to recycle that and turn it into new fuel to go into our powerhouses. And we're not the only company that can do that. TerraPower also utilizes a similar approach in their technology. So it's a huge opportunity. And what that impacts, though, it does impact as you start thinking through the future of uranium demand and mining and all these things. Well, first of all, for the foreseeable future, we're going to need as much fresh fuel as possible, and we're going to use as much recycled fuel as possible. I don't think the level of demand is going to so far outstrip the ability of the market to respond in any
And that's across everything, right? We're talking basically every fuel source out there.
Yes. I mean, the good news is the tailwinds are pushing this right now. So what just happened, at COP28, the big climate conference, you had a bunch of the major countries in the West, like US, Canada, UK, Japan, I think was involved. They've basically committed over $4 billion to building out more uranium enrichment capacity, right? So you have these countries around the world investing in that infrastructure. And in addition, in the US, President Biden just put the finishing touches on this new rule and requirement that basically bans imports of Russian enriched uranium. Right. And so this is going to now our 94 operating reactors in the U.S. Currently 20% of that fuel source was coming from Russia. So this is a very significant impact on the supply chain for U.S. capacity. Now, with that, obviously, this is not happening tomorrow. They have some time before this really goes into place. But also the federal government is investing $2.7 billion to help bolster the domestic uranium enrichment capacity here. So there's a lot of really positive signals, both domestically and internationally, that is building out this supply chain for fuel. So that's a really good thing in our mind, both for advanced reactors, for traditional reactors, for all of it, because we're going to need it. So even if we get recycling up and going, there's still going to be a huge demand for fresh fuel as well.
I think a lot of investors and consumers look at this as a one versus the other. And I think as this story continues to develop, more and more people are recognizing that it's everything. We need oil, we need gas. Like you said, in India and China, they're still building coal plants. This isn't going away anytime soon, but nuclear's part of the story has become larger and larger, and we think that's going to continue. And just hearing you talk for the last half hour or so, it's clear to me that we're probably in the second pitch of the first inning of this development. Is that fair to say, or kind of where are we with the way this is growing right now?
It's important to realize in the United States, for example, 20% of our overarching energy is just for electricity. That means 80% of it is not electricity. It's for all other types of fuels, whether it's transportation fuels or industrial heat or manufacturing processes. So although nuclear energy can be used for industrial process heat and other applications, we're not going to be replacing hydrocarbons anytime soon, right? We're going to need oil and gas for many, many, many decades to come, especially for many of these transportation related applications, industrial processes. First of all, most of the products, materials, clothing, chemicals that we have are made from fossil fuels. So fertilizer is made from natural gas, right? We feed almost half the world with natural gas. Petrochemicals is growing radically. There is no scenario where we're going to phase out fossil fuel anytime in the near future. This is the lifeblood of human civilization. So we can't phase that out. There really aren't replacements for many of these applications yet that are scalable and cost effective. But all that said, obviously nuclear energy, I believe, is going to play a larger and more substantial role over time and start eating into especially the power aspect of it, and as well as starting to chip away at some of the industrial heat applications. But that's going to take longer, quite frankly, because many of those processes, they've invested already in the equipment, and they're not just going to rip it out, right? They're going to wait till they have to replace that particular furnace or that various power plant on site. So that boiler, et cetera. So they're not just going to rip these things out. So we're going to be somewhat limited based upon what the capital investment cycle in upgrading equipment is in some of these industrial applications. But yeah, over time, we will use a lot more nuclear power. I mean, 25 countries around the world, just at the last climate conference, said they're all going to triple their nuclear energy by 2050. Right. Now, to be fair, I don't put that much credence in a lot of these aspirational goals. That
2050 seems like it's around the corner. The more you read about this stuff, like that's happening tomorrow.
I mean, governments say things all the time, and it's good to have aspirations and good to have goals, but ultimately it's about the market embracing these things and driving it forward. And we are seeing just tremendous uptake and traction in that across the board. I mean, this isn't anything specific to Oklo. You just open up Financial Times, Wall Street Journal, any of these, you're seeing this massive appetite for 24/7 clean power from all of these industries. Right. So clearly, there's going to be a lot of growth in the sector for a whole variety, a healthy ecosystem of companies to really thrive over the next couple decades.
Any other topics that maybe you wanted to get across or wanted to mention to our listeners that I didn't have the foresight to ask? Anything else that we should be thinking about out there?
No, I think we had a good mix of different topics here, from fuel recycling to growth in kind of these sectors like data center and industry and some of the different technologies. So I'm feeling good about kind of what we covered, but happy to come back anytime. I really appreciate the opportunity. And, if people want to learn more about any of the ideas we've been talking about today, one is I try to share as much as I can of what I'm learning on now it's called X, formerly Twitter. So you can find me at my name, at Brian Gitt, Gitt is a good place. Also, I try to write about what I'm learning often on my website, briangitt.com. You can also get the book that you mentioned earlier called In the Dark, Fixing Energy Policies That Hurt People and the Planet. You can get that on my website. I actually give it away, the digital version, for free. I don't make any money on the book. The book is mainly just to get the information out there. The hard copy is like $9. It includes shipping. It's just their cost to print it and ship it. So anyways, those are some places people can learn a little bit more about these topics. And then obviously what we're doing at Oklo, go and check it out. Go to oklo.com. We have some good content, a really cool recycling video. If you want to learn more about fuel recycling, go to that tab on oklo.com. And there's a great 3-minute video you can watch that breaks down the whole fuel recycling process.
Well, really cool, Brian. And I really appreciate you taking the time. This is really, usable information that people can go out and be smarter about the way they think about how they consume, but also how they can invest. So I really appreciate your time today. And once again, thank you for your generosity and sharing some information with us.
Thanks for having me on. Appreciate it.
And once again, I'm your host, Ed Coyne, and thank you all for listening to Sprott Radio.
This podcast is provided for information purposes only from sources believed to be reliable. However, Sprott does not warrant its completeness or accuracy. Any opinions and estimates constitute our judgment as of the date of this material and are subject to change without notice. Past performance is not indicative of future results. This communication is not intended as an offer or solicitation for the purchase or sale of any financial instrument. Any opinions and recommendations herein do not take into account individual client circumstances, objectives, or needs, and are not intended as recommendations of particular securities, financial instruments, or strategies. You must make your own independent decisions regarding any securities, financial instruments, or strategies mentioned or related to the information herein. This communication may not be redistributed or retransmitted in whole or in part, or in any form or manner without the express written consent of Sprott. Any unauthorized use or disclosure is prohibited. Receipt and review of this information constitutes your agreement not to redistribute or retransmit the contents and information contained in this communication without first obtaining express permission from an authorized officer of Sprott.